Pramantam Ena. Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. In the continuation of reading Srila Prabhupada's Lilamrita, the leaflet went on to extol Krishna consciousness over any other high. It included phrases like end all, bring downs, and turn on, and it spoke against employing artificially induced methods of self realization and expanded consciousness. Someone objected to the flyers playing too much of the hippie mentality, but Prabhupada said it was all right. Greg, when these drug people on the Lower East Side came and talked to Swamiji, he was so patient with them. He was speaking on a philosophy which they had never heard before. When someone takes LSD, they are really into themselves and they don't hear properly when someone talks to them. So Swamiji would make particular points and they couldn't understand him. So he would have to make the same point again. He was very patient with these people, but he would not give in to their claim that LSD was a bona fide spiritual aid to self realization. October 1966, Tompkins Square Park was the park on the Lower East Side on the south. It was bordered by 7th Street with its 4 and 5 storied brownstone tenements. On the north side was 10th with more brownstones, but in better condition, and the very old small building that housed the Tompkins Square branch of the New York Public Library. On Avenue B, the park's east border stood straight. Bridge Church, built in 1848, when the neighborhood had been entirely Irish. The church, school, and rectory still occupied much of the block, and the west border of the Park Avenue A was lined with tiny old candy stores selling newspapers, magazines, cigarettes, and egg cream sodas at the counter. There were also a few bars, several grocery stores, and a couple of Slavic restaurants specializing in inexpensive vegetable broths, which brought Ukrainians and hippies side by side for bodily nourishment. The park's 10 acres held many tall trees, but at least half the park was paved. A network of 5 foot high, heavy wrought iron fences weaved through the park, lining the walkways and protecting the grass. The fences and the many walkways and entrances to the park gave it the effect of a maze. Since the weather was still warm and it was Sunday, the park was crowded with people. Almost all the space on the benches that lined the walkways was occupied. There were old people, mostly Ukrainians, dressed in outdated suits and sweaters, even in the warm weather, sitting together in clans talking. There were many children in the park also, mostly Puerto Ricans and blacks, but also fair haired, hard faced slum kids racing around on bikes or playing with balls and frisbees. The basketball and handball courts were mostly taken by the teenagers, and as always, there were plenty of loose running dogs. A marble miniature gazebo, 4 pillars, and a roof with a drinking fountain inside was a remnant from the old days, 1891, according to the inscription. On its 4 sides were the words hope, faith, charity, and temperance, but someone had sprayed the whole structure with black paint, making crude designs and illegible names and initials. Today, a bench had been taken over by several Congo and bongo drummers, and the whole park pulsed with their demanding rhythms. And the hippies were there, different from the others. The bearded Bohemian men and their long haired young girlfriends dressed in old blue jeans were still an unusual sight. Even in the Lower East Side melting pot, their presence created tension. They were from middle class families and so they had not been driven to the slums by dire economic necessities. This created conflicts in their dealings with the underprivileged immigrants, and the hippies, well known proclivity for psychedelic drugs, their revolt against their families and affluence, and their absorption in the avant-garde sometimes made them the Jeed minority among their neighbors. But the hippies just wanted to do their own thing and create their own revolution for love and peace. So usually they were tolerated, although not appreciated. There were various groups among the young and hip at Tompkins Square Park. They were friends who had gone to the same schools together, who took the same drug together, or who agreed on a particular philosophy of art, literature, politics, or metaphysics. They were lovers. They were groups hanging out together for reasons undecipherable, except for the common purpose of doing their own thing. And there were others who lived like hermits. A loner would sit on a park bench analyzing the effects of cocaine, looking up at the strangely rustling green leaves of the trees and the blue sky above the tenements, and then down to the garbage at his feet, as he helplessly followed his mind from fear to illumination, to disgust to hallucination, on, until after a few hours the drug began to wear off and he was again a common stranger. Sometimes they would sit up all night, spaced out in the park, until at last, in the light of morning, they would stretch out on benches to sleep. Hippies especially took to the park on Sundays. They at least passed through the park on their way to St. Mark's Place, Greenwich Village, or the Lexington Avenue subway at Astor Place, or the IND subway at Houston and Second, or to catch an uptown bus on First Avenue, or downtown bus on Second, or a crosstown on Ninth. Or they went to the park just to get out of their apartments and sit together in the open air, to get high again, to talk or to walk through the park's maze of pathways. But whatever the hippies' diverse interests and drivers, the Lower East Side was an essential part of the mystic. It was not just a dirty slum, it was the best place in the world to conduct the experiment in consciousness. For all its filth and threat of violence and the confined life of its brownstone tenements, the Lower East Side was still the forefront of the revolution in mind expansion. Unless you were living there and taking psychedelic or marijuana, or at least intellectually pursuing the quest for free personal religion, you weren't enlightened and you weren't taking part in the most progressive evolution of human consciousness. And it was this searching, a quest beyond the humdrum existence of the ordinary, materialistic, straight American, that brought unity to the otherwise ele- eclectic gathering of hippies on the Lower East Side. Into this chaotic pagan Swamiji entered with his followers and sat down to hold a kirtan. Three or four devotees who arrived ahead of him selected an open area of the park, put out the oriental carpet Robert Nelson had donated, sat down on it, and began playing kartalas and chanting Hare Krishna. Immediately, some boys rode up on their bicycles, braked just short of the carpet, and stood aside their bikes, curiously and irreverently staring. Other passers-by gathered to listen. Meanwhile, Swamiji, accompanied by a half a dozen disciples, was walking the 8 blocks from the storefront. Brahmananda carried the harmonium and the Swami's drums. Kirtanananda, who was now shaven-headed at Swamiji's request and dressed in loose, flowing canary yellow robes, created an extra sensation. Drivers pulled their cars over to have a look, their passengers leaning forward, agape at the outrageous dress and shaved head. As the group passed a store, people inside would poke each other and indicate the spectacle. People came to the windows of their tenements, taking in the Swami and his group as if a parade were passing. Thus, the Puerto Rico, though guys especially, couldn't restrain themselves from exaggerated reactions. Hey Buddha, they taunted. Hey, you forgot to change your pajamas. They made shrill screams as if imitating Indian war whoops they had heard in Hollywood westerns. So we stop here for today's reading it here. Today's reading is not much of thing being getting explained the environment around where Prabhupada was planning to conduct the Kirtana. You see about the environment and the kind of people resided over there. Looks like there is no hopes. But That is what is a materialistic kind of natural person feels. Prabhupada had already had a vision and he knew that this was the right place to uplift the consciousness and expand the consciousness of these people. And we see that Prabhupada, along with his disciples, go to the Thompson Square Park and starts to conduct a Kirtana, where it takes an attraction and pulls on to a little bit crowd to understand what this group is and creates a kind of an curious kind to understand what is this group belongs to. So pretty much that is about it. But if you see that largest crowd is more of that hippies kind who are always into the LSD drug and in the mode of expanding the consciousness using the LSD drug. While we also see that equally Prabhupada's patient to make them understand, even though the questions were being repeated, since they were already influenced by the drug, not able to understand what Prabhupada's point was of explanation. So we continue.